Well, here we are. We are 5 years from the start of the COVID pandemic, and a lot of people are still understandably confused about what happened and what to do in the next one. So, to help out, I got a guest who knows a ton about COVID, a ton about vaccines, and a ton about infectious diseases. His name is Dr. Paul Offit. Paul Offit is the director of the Vaccine Education Center of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is an internationally recognized expert in the fields of virology and immunology, and he is a member of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And he is a founding advisory board member for the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research. And on top of all of that, he is a pediatrician and an author, writing several books on the topics of vaccines and vaccine science, one of which will be a main topic of this talk, which is his most recent book, Tell Me When It's Over, an insider's guide to deciphering COVID myths and navigating the post-pandemic world. Stick around to hear Paul address the most common questions and most viral misinformation talking points that emerged during the pandemic and more. Enjoy the talk, and I'll see you after the video. All right, so here I am with Dr. Paul Offit. You know his credentials, you know his aura. He is one of the best vaccinologists and vaccine communicators out there. Paul, we're here to talk about your book and talk about the COVID pandemic 5 years later and what's going on right now. So just to get started, let's just hit on this fact that COVID killed about 20 million people worldwide. That's a big number, but often we know that people's experience overrides facts that they hear. So let me just ask you, as a pediatrician, what did you see during the COVID pandemic that has stuck with you?
We were overwhelmed by this virus at our hospital. I mean, I work at Children's Hospital Philadelphia, and in 2020, we had nothing, right? We didn't have antivirals till October of 2020. We didn't have monoclonals till November. We didn't have vaccines till December. We didn't have vaccines for children less than 12 until we had vaccines for anyone over 18 in December, but then wasn't approved till the following May that we had vaccines for younger children. So we were overwhelmed. We had 3 floors of COVID, and nurses were wearing bandanas instead of masks. Some were wearing garbage bags instead of gowns, because we just were overwhelmed by this virus and we didn't have the resources. It was a fight for ventilators. I remember the ICU was overwhelmed. We were making decisions about who could or couldn't come to the ICU, and we were taking care of some children on the floor instead of the ICU who really should have been in the ICU. And this meant it was hard for us to take care of our other patients. We canceled elective surgeries. It was overwhelming. And, this is a virus which can be transmitted asymptomatically, and it was potentially fatal. So it was a frightening time. What was the other thing that was interesting to me was, because I'd never seen it before, was this multi-system inflammatory disease of children, where children would have a relatively benign infection, get better, and then, weeks later come back with severe lung, liver, heart disease, occasionally fatal, often in the ICU. This sort of rebound phenomenon is what it looked like. And I had never seen that before. That's pretty much gone away. You don't see much of that anymore, but it was amazing to me how overwhelming that was. And it was a little angering. I mean, once vaccines were available for children down to 12 years of age, then down to 5 years of age, and people still chose not to get their children vaccinated. So they didn't want to get the vaccine, but they were perfectly willing to burden our healthcare system. I mean, you were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized, 12 times more likely to die in 2021 if you weren't vaccinated than if you were. Come on, help us out. Help us out here. So it was a trying time. People were working double shifts. It was really emotionally difficult.
Yeah, I think that kind of viewpoint is kind of lost on a lot of people, because if you look online, a lot of people say that COVID wasn't really as big a deal as we might have thought a few years ago. A lot of people seem to think that if you were just unhealthy, then you were at risk, or if you were old, you were at risk. But if you were young and healthy, then you shouldn't have to have been at risk. You shouldn't have to have worn a mask or taken precautions or gotten vaccinated. How did we end up with that perception, and what's wrong with it?
Denialism. I mean, there were about 1,800 children who died, meaning less than 18 years of age, who died from COVID during this pandemic. Many were perfectly healthy. This virus was perfectly willing to kill you, even if you were healthy. And so protect your child. It was just a lot of denialism and misrepresentation of the facts associated with this pandemic, more so than anything I've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there's particularly a lot of confusion about who should get vaccinated. And when I say vaccinated, I mean who should get those first 2 doses of vaccine, which was recommended at first. And a lot of people seem to have been confused on your stance, particularly with who should get those first 2 vaccines of COVID, even to the point where Marty Makary on Dr. Mike's podcast recently said that you didn't want your sons to get vaccinated with COVID vaccines.
Not true.
I think he's confusing your stance on getting vaccinated with who should get boosted. So maybe we should just squash that myth and talk about who should get those first 2 doses and the logic behind who should or might not care about getting boosted.
Right. So when the vaccine came out in December, the Pfizer vaccine was discussed on December 10th by the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee, on which I sit, and then a week later we discussed Moderna's vaccine. So that launched as a 2-dose vaccine, given with a separation of 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the vaccine. I think what we then pretty quickly learned was that it was of value to have a 3rd dose, meaning that was separated by several months. I mean, you sort of boosted memory responses to a greater extent with that 3rd dose. So I think that made sense. But I think eventually, by the time Omicron came in, which was December 2021, I think that 3rd dose made sense. What I was recommending for my son, or for arguably any healthy young person, was that the booster dose is beyond there. Do we need to treat this virus as the same manner that we treat flu, which is to give a vaccine dose every year to children, anybody over 6 months of age? That's what I was arguing against. I think that's what he's confusing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people might see that as, oh, maybe the boosters are harmful. But when I read your book, I got more of a sense of, there are some theoretical concerns about everybody boosting, but more so just everybody should get those first at least 2 doses of COVID vaccine to get that protection against severe disease. And then beyond that, if people want to boost, fine. But let's focus on boosting everybody or vaccinating everybody with those first few doses beforehand. Is that more accurate?
Yeah, it was confusing. I mean, so it came out as a 2-dose vaccine. I remember starting in December 2020. And then in August of 2021, President Biden stood up in front of the public and said, as of a month hence in September 2021, we, the executive branch of the federal government, are going to be arguing for getting a booster dose. Now, that was considered by our committee, and we voted against that for anybody less than 65 who was otherwise healthy. It was considered by the ACIP, which advises the CDC, also before that September deadline, and they too said no. So that was confusing to people. Here, President Biden was saying everybody needs a 3rd dose, and here the committees weren't. And that's when I wasn't recommending a 3rd dose for my son. But then when the Omicron variant came in, and which was a kind of crossed the line. It really was much more highly mutated and not as easily recognized by antibodies as the Alpha and Delta variants that had preceded it. But then the 3rd dose made sense, and then we did recommend a 3rd dose. But if you look at the data, even from December 2021, 2 doses was highly effective at preventing severe disease. That became less true once Omicron came in. That's when the 3rd dose was of value. So, but it's confusing. I think anybody who was paying attention to this was confused by it, because the language around it was confusing. Like on one hand, people, the CDC would say, well, there's like being fully protected and being up to date. They tried to make that distinction. There was the fully protected group and the up to date group, and that was confusing. Confusing to me.
Yeah, it was a lot of confusing messaging, and I think a lot of what confused people as well is a lot of what I see shared pretty frequently online, even by people who are not anti-vaccine or not anti-science, are clips of communicators or elected officials saying that if you get COVID vaccinated, then you're not going to get COVID and it's going to stop transmission. That was not good to say. That was not a good thing to tell people. And it further confused the purpose of vaccinating and how effective those first two doses, at least two doses, can be for people, which is something you go over pretty well in your book. And baked into that was a mistake in messaging by the CDC itself, calling these cases of COVID following vaccination breakthrough infections. So what was that mistake, and what is the true purpose of COVID vaccines, and how do we better do this next time?
So the purpose of the COVID vaccine, it's really the purpose of all vaccines, is to keep you out of the hospital. That's the goal. For these kinds of viruses, so-called short incubation period viruses, which is to say from the time when you're exposed to the virus to when you develop symptoms, like SARS-CoV-2 or influenza or parainfluenza or respiratory syncytial virus, those viruses are going to continue to circulate. Even if the entire world were vaccinated, that virus is going to continue to circulate, which is why the notion of just let this virus run wild and it'll burn out was always wrong. And I think people knew that was always wrong. I think the breakthrough thing came in July of 2021 when thousands of men, 80% of whom were vaccinated, went to Provincetown, Massachusetts to celebrate the July 4th holiday, and there was an outbreak of COVID. And so 346 men who had been vaccinated, had received 2 doses of the vaccine, because this is still 2021, got COVID. 4 were hospitalized, 4 of 346, so a hospitalization rate of around 1.2%. That's great. That's a vaccine working well. That is a moment to celebrate. It's doing what it's supposed to do, keeping you out of the hospital. The other 342 had either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infection, a win. But nonetheless, the term that the CDC used when they published the results of that outbreak was they called that breakthrough infections. The term breakthrough implies failure. This wasn't a failure. This was success. It should have been trumpeted as a success, and it wasn't. And that the media picked that up. I remember I had to be on CNN once, so I was watching the episodes before me, because you have to kind of go in like their virtual green room for about 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And they were talking about Brett Kavanaugh, who had, just as part of a routine screening while walking into the Supreme Court chambers, had been found to be positive. So he was asymptomatically positive. A win. But if you watched the way that was carried on TV, you would have thought the man was fighting for his life. Actually, Lindsey Graham at the time also had 2 doses, also had a mild infection, which included mild sinusitis. And he said, quote, "This would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated." Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a mistake of messaging. And I think a lot of people felt like, oh, vaccines, and they immediately think polio and measles. And you don't see cases of polio and measles. So people were probably confused. Well, if I get vaccinated and I get COVID, but I get vaccinated against measles and polio and I don't get polio, what's wrong with the what's wrong with the COVID vaccine? And I think it's a misunderstanding of the incubation period of the virus, which is the real thing that they're looking for. And also a mistake in the purpose of vaccines.
Right. No, so the ones you mentioned are long incubation periods. Right. So even then, all you need is immunological memory. There's plenty of time for those memory cells to become activated and then protect you against even mild disease. And so therefore, you can eliminate those diseases, like smallpox was a long incubation period disease. Measles is a long incubation period disease, which we eliminated from this country by the year 2000. It's come back because a critical percentage of parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children. Mm-hmm. Rubella or German measles, long incubation period disease, which we've eliminated by the year 2005 by vaccination. Polio, we eliminated by 1979. So you can eliminate long incubation period diseases. And when people stood up and signed the Great Barrington Declaration and said, let's just let this virus run wild and it'll burn out, they weren't understanding that that's not this kind of virus. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that created the rotavirus vaccine. Probably 95% of children get that vaccine. And this was a virus that caused 70,000 hospitalizations a year. It's the rare child who comes into the hospital now with dehydration caused by severe vomiting and fever and diarrhea caused by that virus. It's the rare child, but that virus still circulates in the community and still causes mild disease. And occasionally we see it in the emergency department. And that's with a very high vaccination rate. We did what we needed to do, which was basically dramatically reduce or eliminate hospitalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to be clear for people listening, the authors of that Great Barrington Declaration are people like Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, and a champion of that Great Barrington Declaration is RFK Jr. But before we move away from the vaccine topic, I just want to be extra clear here. So a lot of people maybe didn't get vaccinated from COVID vaccines due to, I think it comes down to two things when I talk to people. It's fears on harms. People think that getting vaccinated with COVID, they're young and healthy, they don't need the vaccine, and it's gonna harm them in some way. And they often say, where there's risk, there must be choice. What do you respond to with that kind of concern or logic when it comes to a decision not to vaccinate against COVID?
No, I think you should always take the least risky route. That's true. It's because a choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's just to take a choice to take a different risk. So what does that risk look like? That vaccine probably saved about 3 million people's lives in this country. That vaccine, for people who chose not to get the vaccine, was estimated that somewhere around 230,000 people died unnecessarily, died because they chose not to get the vaccine. Now, the mRNA vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna, do have risk. Frankly, anything that has a positive effect in your body can have a negative effect. If it never had a negative effect, it probably never had a positive effect. So, of course, there are risks to vaccines. So the question is weighing risks and benefits. So, for example, the mRNA vaccines were a rare cause of myocarditis. Overall, it was around 1 in 50,000, could be as high as 1 in 6,600 for the 16 to 18-year-old. But again, it was generally short-lived, transient, self-resolving. Nonetheless, on the other hand, as a child, if you got the COVID and you got the so-called multi-system inflammatory disease, that caused myocarditis in about 50% of children, as much as 75% of children, and much more serious, often would land you in the ICU. So make the less risky choice. True. The problem when people say the sort of medical freedom movement of, it's my body, my choice, I want to, there's no, as you said, no risk-free situation. But often you're miseducated about risks and benefits, and that's the problem. People make a bad choice because they're given bad information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and right. So like even it is always about risk versus benefit, and that's what people like you on the advisory committee of immunization practices and the FDA advisory boards, that's what you all do when you're approving a vaccine. You're weighing risk versus benefits. And when you continue to recommend a vaccine, even after it's been given to millions of people, you're still actively weighing those risks and benefits. And I think that a lot of people don't really understand how that works.
No, I'll give you another example. When I came onto the advisory committee for immunization practices in 1998, it was my interest to head the polio virus working group. I wanted to move us away from the oral polio vaccine, right? So Jonas Salk's vaccine, the inactivated vaccine, was made by taking poliovirus, growing it up in cells, and killing it, inactivating it with a chemical. And that vaccine was used between 1955 and early 1960s, but it was replaced by the oral polio vaccine, which was basically eliminated polio from this country by 1979. But it had a bad side effect, or adverse event, which is that about roughly 1 per 2.4 million doses was complicated by developing polio. That virus could actually revert, if you will, to paralytic strain, to norovirulent strain. And so although we eliminated polio by 1979 in the United States, throughout the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, every year 8 to 10 children would get polio from the polio vaccine. So it was my interest to get us away from the oral polio vaccine back to the inactivated vaccine, because there were Scandinavian countries that eliminated polio using only the inactivated vaccine. Now, the activated vaccine was more expensive. It was more difficult to give because it was given as a shot. You didn't get so-called contact immunity, meaning 25% of people living in the home of someone who got the oral polio vaccine would essentially become vaccinated because that virus was shed in the feces and could be spread by hand-mouth behavior. But I wanted to get us away from that because it just didn't make sense for us to continue to do that. And we did that by the year 2000, haven't used that vaccine for 25 years, we used only the inactivated vaccine. But those strains, those so-called revertant strains that were derived from the vaccine, they're still around. And that's why in 2022, a man in Rockland County, New York, developed paralysis, even though he never left the country, because he was infected with one of those revertant strains, which was around. And remember, when you get paralyzed by polio, you're the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Only about 1 in 200 people who infected with polio are paralyzed. So when they tested wastewater in his county and surrounding counties, there was that virus. It's the same virus that's causing the outbreak in Gaza. And I really wish the CDC would look in wastewater in Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, to see whether that virus is there, because I think it is, because international travel is common. Many countries still use the oral polio vaccine. I just think people should realize that's the risk of not vaccinating. And in this man whose community who had gotten paralyzed by polio, that particular strain, immunization rates were around 30%. So when you drop immunization rates far enough, polio could come back. And believe me, that is not a disease you want to see come back.
No, we don't want to see that. And it could happen if vaccination rates drop. And yeah, just to really be clear on that point you were making about IPV and OPV when it comes to risk, because I see a lot of people sharing articles like, more polio vaccine is causing more cases of polio than wild polio in certain regions of the world. But that's because wild polio is not very prevalent, and thanks to vaccination. And before vaccination, there were many orders of magnitude more cases of polio than the dozens of cases that OPV causes. So when it comes to risk, I like to say it's not vaccinating for polio is the highest risk. OPV is way down here, and IPV is by far the lowest.
It's IPV is safe, utterly safe. I mean, there's, other than pain and redness at the injection site, it's safe. It's whole killed virus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, but getting back to COVID vaccines and why people, I think, didn't want to vaccinate and still choose not to. Aside from concerns of harm, which we just discussed, COVID vaccines give way more benefit than they do than they pose in terms of risk. The other reason is mandates. It always comes back to mandates. When I talk to people about COVID vaccines, they're always upset that they were mandated to take COVID vaccines. What do you think about mandates? How do you view this personal freedom, and what do you think about this kind of mantra that people say, which is, why should I get vaccinated if your vaccine works?
Well, one, no vaccine works 100% of the time. Two, not everybody can be vaccinated. So they depend on those around them to protect them. SARS-CoV-2 is the cause of COVID is an example of that. It's a contagious disease. I mean, if you step on a rusty nail and you go to your doctor and you say, I don't want a tetanus vaccine, and you get tetanus, no one's going to catch tetanus from you. It's not a contagious disease. This is. So when you get onto the elevator, you get in a bus, and you've chosen not to vaccinate, you've chosen to experience that disease, realize that there are people who depend on you because they can't be vaccinated. I think the best example for that was when there was a measles outbreak in California around 2014. Senator Richard Pan took it upon himself. He was a pediatrician by training. And California was the epicenter of that outbreak, which then spread to like 25 other states. And he wanted to basically eliminate the philosophical exemption in the state, California, that didn't have a religious exemption. So therefore, there would only be medical exemptions. And he was successful. And one of the reasons he was successful, because obviously the anti-vaccine people were there in force arguing against this bill, so-called SB 277. And this little boy named Red Crowett was bravely stood up. There's all these parents who are carrying signs, and they're angry and they're screaming. This little boy, the 7-year-old, I think, who his name was Red Crowett, who had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He got up on a stool so he could reach the microphone, and he'd said, "Look, I have leukemia. I can't be vaccinated. I depend on you to protect me. Don't I count?" To me, he was the voice of society, a voice that's becoming dimmer and dimmer as time goes on.
Yeah. You don't really see the people who suffer most from infectious disease, partly because a lot of the people who suffer most aren't around anymore. You can't hear from them anymore. And their voices, yeah.
There was just, I remember I gave one talk in Florida, I remember. And it was maybe there were 150 people there, but it was all included the general public. And I remember one person stood up and said, I got chicken pox. Everybody at my table got chicken pox. I mean, we're all fine. I said, well, where are the 75 to 100 people that die from chicken pox every year? Where are they? How come they're not in the audience? Let's hear from them.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, it is tough though, because a lot of people felt forced by mandates. A lot of people felt like they did more harm than good when it comes to trust in medical science, and especially with the whole miscommunication about COVID vaccines and transmission. It seemed to create a perfect storm for anti-vaxxers and people who want to spread disinformation to take advantage of that. But if we really just take a step back and look at what mandates did, do you think that mandates saved lives during the pandemic?
Yes, I do. In a better world, you wouldn't need to mandate these vaccines. I mean, I think anybody who looked at the data would get vaccinated. I mean, I would argue in December when part of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, I looked at the 800 pages of data that we were given, sort of 400 for each vaccine for the December 10th and December 17th meetings. I think I was an informed consumer about that vaccine, and I couldn't wait to get vaccinated. I practically cried when I finally got a vaccine. But now finally, I had a way to protect myself other than just social distancing and masking. So the problem is when people is how people get their information, because any reasonable person wouldn't have needed to have gotten a mandate. They knowing the data, they would get the vaccine. But when your hospital is overwhelmed with this virus and you aren't able to take care of even not only children with COVID, but other children who were there, and you're canceling elective surgeries, and it's all hands on deck, and everybody's working double shifts, help us out. I mean, so I think mandates, believe me, in 2021 made perfect sense to me. But you're right. I think we're a country founded on individual rights and freedoms. We don't like to be told what to do, and we don't like that you have a card that showed you were vaccinated to get into your favorite bar or restaurant or sporting event or place of worship. People didn't like that. And the year before, 2020, people didn't like it that we closed schools, shuttered businesses, restricted travel, insisted on testing and masking. I think people saw this as massive government overreach. I think we leaned into a libertarian left hook, and we're still feeling the effects of that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, it's tough to convince people, especially when there are loud voices spreading disinformation, fueling the side of the reason to not get vaccinated, the health side of the reason to not get vaccinated. They're worried about harms. They see what they feel is government overreach, and it's like I said, it's kind of a perfect storm. But
the one thing you said that just really struck me is where there's risk, there should be choice. Sure, risk to whom? I mean, not only risk to you, but risk to others. Mm-hmm. And remember, children don't get to make that choice. You're making that choice for them. And it's just, I agree. I think where there's risk, there should be choice, but there should be the right choice based on the right data. Because what that implies in the anti-vaccine world is that the risks outweigh the benefits, which is just not true.
Yeah.
Not for the COVID vaccine. I mean, I think it was true for the oral polio vaccine at a point. You could make that argument that once we'd eliminated polio from this country, why take any risk from the oral polio vaccine? Let's go to the inactivated vaccine. And that was important because there was another vaccine. I mean, there was an alternative vaccine.
Mm-hmm. And I think stories like that should be reassuring to people that we are constantly looking at risk benefit. Like there wasn't unnecessary risk in giving OPV to the American public. And so we switched. We made it safer. And we're constantly doing that with other vaccines too. And also with the mandate situation. The mandates were implemented at a time when thousands of Americans were dying either every week or every day to COVID. And we have to do something. We have to do something to stop that mass amount of suffering. And ideally, people would know the data and understand I need to get vaccinated to protect myself and others. even if the vaccine isn't perfect at preventing transmission, it's going to do a lot right now if I can protect myself and briefly protect people around me. But not everybody really. And then the mandates went away when the public health risk was much lower to the public.
Mhm.
But not everybody saw the data. Not everybody understood the importance of that choice. And
No, someone would get like, so now I'm mandated to get a vaccine, right? I get the vaccine and then I get a mild or moderate infection,
Mhm.
which is at least kept you out of the hospital, but it's not fun having a mild or moderate infection. You cough for a few days, you have low grade fever or higher fever, and you're thinking, they made me get this vaccine and I still got sick. And I think we didn't explain very early what this vaccine could and couldn't do.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that was an issue for sure. Um, but a lot of people, including some public health commentators on the internet today, um, they like to attribute um, a lot of misinformation or a lot of the reason why people believe anti-vaccine misinformation to um, these missteps by communicators in public health and in government. Um, while they tend not to attribute as much blame to people like RFK Jr. or Del Bigtree or the other anti-vaccine advocates who have been spreading more anti-vaccine disinformation and gaining more reach since the pandemic started. Um, so why why are these people becoming so much more successful after the pandemic in spreading disinformation?
Again, I do think that there was a massive libertarian uprising in the name of sort of medical freedom in response to what happened in 2020 and 2021, and to some extent in 2022. I think that was it. Um, People didn't like it, and so if you don't like it, the best way to sort of cast it aside is to say they're wrong about everything. And I think that's kind of where we are now. The other thing, this is in line with this, is that I think we like conspiracy. I think we're drawn to conspiracy for a lot of reasons. One, because it's they're fun, they're entertaining. The lab leak is a perfect example. I mean, this understanding where this virus started is important, right? We had a SARS-1 outbreak in 2002. We had a MERS outbreak in 2012. These are both coronaviruses derived from bats, and now we have SARS-CoV-2 that came in late 2019. So this isn't the end of it. I mean, we live in close association with bats. If you look in rural China, for example, 1 in 40 people will have antibodies to bat viruses. These spillover events happen all the time, these animal to human spillover events. And that's what happened in the southwestern section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market in late 2019. All the genetic evidence is there at one particular stall. All the original cases were that spread out from there. Phylogenetic analysis showed that people that were infected with viruses that were there. And it wasn't a lab leak. It wasn't some evil scientist doing something at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Plus, there were 2 lineages that were born of that outbreak in that one particular section of the market. And the animals that were there, like bamboo rats and palm civets and raccoon dogs, were exactly the kind of animals that would be secondary hosts as you go from bat to animal to intermediate animal to humans. Nonetheless, 2/3 of the American public, independent of whether or not what their political affiliation, believes in a lab leak, something that's never happened before. Never before in the history of humankind has a pandemic virus, been created in the lab. So you need to have a little higher of a bar than just sort of innuendo and conspiracy. I mean, all the published data, Science, Cell, Nature, all point to that. Where's published data in a peer-reviewed journal that this was a lab leak? Nonetheless, there's Marty Makary testifying in front of Congress. Now, may well be head of the FDA. Jay Bhattacharya also testifying, that this was a lab leak. Robert Redfield, former director of the CDC, said that. Luc Montagnier has said that this was a lab leak. I mean, winner of the Nobel Prize in 2008 for discovering HIV as a cause of AIDS. So what is someone to believe when you have experts standing up and Nobel Prize winners standing up and saying that? It's hard to ask the public to understand this. I think it is.
Yeah, and it's a lot easier for a lot of people to believe that it's not nature being unpredictable and scary and producing a pandemic virus that can threaten society, it's much simpler for a lot of people to believe that powers that be in the government or whatever, fill in whatever blank, uh, created it. And you have to go over to those tangible threats and take those tangible threats out, as opposed to dealing with this more nebulous reality that we live in, that nature can produce viruses and pathogens that can cripple us as societies. But we're getting into lab leak now. It's kind of ridiculous that so many people who could be in high-ranking positions in government subscribe to this lab leak idea, and we should be clear that it's not based on any evidence that they believe this. But yet, even the richest man in the world has tweeted multiple times saying that. I'm talking about Elon Musk, by the way. Elon Musk has tweeted multiple times saying that Fauci should be prosecuted. And so, I mean, it's just, why is this silly? You already kind of went over it, but let's go over maybe some of the common points that people point to. People always talk about the furin cleavage site in the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. Why does that not indicate that it was a lab leak or made in a lab?
Well, first of all, the notion was that this kind of virus didn't exist in nature, that it could only have been created in a lab. That's not true. I mean, there were viruses similar that were found then in nature later, in places like Laos, et cetera, Cambodia. So those viruses do exist. The other thing, recently, just in in December of last year, Shi Zhang Li, who's the head of the virology section, was doing the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology regarding these bat coronaviruses, sequenced like 56 viruses in her lab to show that there was nothing there. There was a precursor that was even close to what was SARS-CoV-2. So those are two lineages. So what are we arguing? We're arguing that two separate people got infected with this virus, either intentionally or just unfortunately, and then traveled to the same section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market, exactly where you would expect a lab leak to occur, instead of going to the 10,000 other places they could have gone, to the city of more than 10 million people, where they could have spread this virus. Why did they go there? I mean, it's like the Red Queen in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You're asked to expect, to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of a really impossible scenario, no matter how you look at it. If you look at it as an accidental event, then it's really it's a real stretch of the imagination that it could make it from the accidental point of release of the lab all the way to the animal market, which we know is selling animals that are known to carry coronaviruses, and was selling them illegally, and have it end up right exactly like you said, where you'd expect it to be. And then even if it was a purposeful release, I mean, it was very clear that China tried to hide what was going on in those early weeks, especially, and kind of sweep it under the rug. And despite their efforts, they weren't able to contain it, and it affected their own nation too in a pretty significant way. So it doesn't really make sense for a purposeful release either. But yet, the richest man in the world still is tweeting these ridiculous things and believing them. But that's not the only thing that the world's richest man has been tweeting about when it comes to COVID conspiracies. He recently tweeted an image of all the quote-unquote COVID conspiracies that he considers he was correct about. One of them being hydroxychloroquine as a cure for COVID. And this also gets into a kind of a messy story with the FDA and President-elect Trump. So what's the data with hydroxychloroquine and COVID, and how do we know what the truth about it is?
Right. So in 2020, we didn't have anything, right? And yet here's a virus that was circulating that was killing people. So people were looking for something else, something that was already in the pharmacy, something that had already been licensed for other reasons, to then repurpose for COVID. And so there were studies done in vitro, meaning in the laboratory, to looking for something that might work. And hydroxychloroquine looked like it might work, or ivermectin looked like it might work. Okay, well, the good news is You can tell whether or not it works by doing the right kinds of studies. And that's what was done. There were several studies done, at least 3 large studies that were done, prospective controlled studies where people fairly early in their COVID illness were given hydroxychloroquine or not given hydroxychloroquine, and then followed to see whether or not the drug prevented hospitalizations. And it did, again and again and again, at least 3 large studies. Now, the thing is because we were looking for something, anything to hang on to, especially the Trump administration was looking for a magic medicine to guide them out of this. And there was a terrible study that was published by, not at least referred to by Raoul Didier in France, I think, who had published something. But as it turns out, there was a lot of fraud in that study. And he clearly had a bias going into that study. And there was a woman named Stella Emanuel who worked with a group called America's Frontline Doctors who said, we don't need to worry about this anymore. We have this magical medicine. It's great. And the Trump administration bought 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine to distribute. And even after the studies had shown it didn't work, Alex Azar, then head of HHS, said, no, you can still use this. We use things off label all the time. You can still use this instead of giving the right message, which it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, it can only do one of 2 things, nothing or hurt. Those are the only 2 options. And this was a drug that can cause, cardiac heart side effects. And so therefore people only continue to put themselves in harm's way and still do that. And the same thing true for ivermectin. It's like, doesn't die. And it's all in the name of medical freedom, right? Don't tell me what to do. I have a friend that this worked for, and so I'm going to use it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And hydroxychloroquine was also championed a lot by Trump in his first term. And to the point where, for some reason, he was really convinced that it was a cure for COVID, that it worked. And so he did some things to kind of force it to be used and treated as a cure. So what exactly happened there?
Well, this was not one of the shining moments for the Food and Drug Administration. I think what happened was in April or so, April of 2020, so before we had anything else, he basically twisted the arm of the FDA to approve its use, or at least authorize its use, not licensed for that reason, but authorized for that purpose. And then the studies were done, and 3 months later, the FDA then removed that authorization. So what that made it look like the FDA didn't know what it was doing. Then on the one hand, they said you could use it because maybe it works. And on the other hand, they said, well, no, don't use it because it doesn't work. And what that showed was that the Trump administration could twist the arm of the FDA. The commissioner at the time was Stephen Hahn. And that really worried people because now you had vaccine trials that were going on. And would they do the same thing with the vaccine trials? Would they twist the arm of the FDA to release a vaccine before it had been adequately shown or tested and found to work and be safe? And I actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times back in October of 2020, fearing an October surprise. And Trump tried to twist the arm of the FDA. He did. He brought Stephen Hahn into the Oval Office and in an invective-laden tirade, let him have it. I want this vaccine out before the election, which was early November. But if you were going to do the right kind of safety studies, which is typically to wait 2 months after the last dose, and at this time it was a 2-dose vaccine, that puts you into December, which was after the election. And Hahn, to his credit, stood tall. He did. He very quickly put it on the website, on the FDA's website. Nope, we're going to follow this for 2 months after the last dose. And he did it. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post basically saying, trust us, we're going to do this the right way. And they did do it the right way. But you can see where a lot of people were worried. In fact, there were a number of states, many states, that formed their own vaccine advisory committees. They didn't trust our FDA vaccine advisory committee because they thought that we too would have our arm twisted. Imagine that. Imagine one state saying, no, you can use this vaccine, but another state saying no.
Yeah. It's a pretty crazy story that science was put that far to the side in favor of politics and political gain. But it seems to be a pretty common trend for people who are responsible for health and vaccine disinformation. They put science to the side and prioritize monetary gain, personal gain, or political gain. And one of the people during the pandemic who arguably got all 3 of those was a guy named Robert Malone. And he kind of emerged on the scene after going on the Joe Rogan podcast, especially as someone who was going to be front and center in this COVID information kind of landscape for at least a few months. And he was a guy who claimed to have invented mRNA vaccines. And you have a chapter about him in your book. So why don't we go over a little bit of what people should think about when looking back at his role in the COVID information landscape?
But so this sort of, once again, falls under the category of kind of like the Nobel Prize deception, meaning people who are really brilliant and are accomplished, well trained, who still stand up and say things that are just absolutely wrong, that has the potential of putting people in harm's way. I mean, Robert Malone is an MD trained, I think, at Northwestern School of Medicine. He did postdoc at Harvard, and he in late 1980s published a paper, Look Your Papers, showing that if you injected mRNA into cells in a laboratory, that you could get a protein to be produced. He then did the same thing with experimental animals like mice and showed that you could get a protein produced. These were the early experiments showing that mRNA could be a drug or could be a vaccine, which is what he said. I mean, you could argue he could reasonably have been considered for the Nobel Prize, but he didn't make a vaccine. I mean, there was still much to do to make sure this was a vaccine. The most important thing is that mRNA is really pro-inflammatory. I mean, it causes a lot of non-specific inflammation. In fact, early on with one of the rabies vaccines, mRNA was used as an adjuvant. So that had to be neutralized. That had to be eliminated. And that was the work of Drew Weissman and Katie Carrico, starting in 1997 at Penn. They figured out how to do that. So that had to happen. And also you had to encase it in a lipid nanoparticle, which also had somewhat of an adjuvant effect to make it a vaccine. So he didn't make a vaccine, but he certainly did an important first step. So therefore, he became an important voice. He's well-spoken. I think in many ways he's a brilliant scientist. And I don't know why people do this. I don't know why people then cross that line. I mean, he testified in front of not only on Joe Rogan, but he was also in front of a congressional committee. He testified, that the mRNA vaccines, and it was in front of Marjorie Taylor Greene's committee, which was sort of a made-up committee. I don't think it was actually a committee. She sort of met in the basement of the Congress and just made this committee up. But in any case, he testified in front of it and said, the mRNA vaccines were, quote unquote, contaminated with DNA, foreign DNA, which could cause cancer, could cause autoimmune diseases, could cause a variety of medical problems, which was utter nonsense. I mean, first of all, any biological that's made with cells as a starting material, or DNA as a starting material, like plasmids, will have small fragments of residual DNA, which are invariably treated with DNA ACE, an enzyme that cuts DNA so that the fragments are tiny. And, we're exposed to foreign DNA all the time, assuming you live on this planet and eat anything made from vegetables or animals on this planet. You will ingest foreign DNA all the time, some of which ends up in your circulation. But, your cells have a way of recognizing foreign DNA and eliminating it. And this DNA would never really cross the nuclear membrane to get to where your DNA is, which is in your nucleus. It would never really be able to insert itself into your DNA. So it was utter nonsense. And it's hard to watch. And this was echoed by the Surgeon General at State of Florida, a guy named Joseph Ladapa, who's also an MD, PhD, also from Harvard, who said the same thing. So it is hard to watch. And I don't blame the public for getting confused. You can see how they're getting confused. I mean, when people who are credentialed and accomplished get up and say those things, how are they supposed to figure it out?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, how are they supposed to? I can sit here and name the red flags that I see when listening to a guy like Malone. Just fact checking a few of his claims, you quickly find that not many of them are true. And I think maybe the most disingenuous one that maybe not obvious, but most disingenuous one when it comes to Malone is that he claims that he's an mRNA vaccine or mRNA vaccine technology inventor. You're an inventor of vaccines. You co-invented the current rotavirus vaccine. You have a product to point to and say, I'm an inventor of vaccines. But he doesn't really have a product to point to say he's an inventor of vaccines. He has patents, but Theranos had patents, and their product, we know that story. It was one of the biggest cases of fraud in the medical industry. Um, and but he doesn't have a product. He has patents, but he doesn't have a product. So I think it's disingenuous of himself to call himself an inventor of mRNA vaccines or vaccine technology.
No, you want to be part of the process. I mean, when me and my colleagues, Fred Clark and Sam Placken, were working on rotavirus, we were a lab among 200 different labs across the world that was trying to understand this virus. I mean, trying to understand what part of the virus made you sick, what part of the virus induced an immune response that was protective. With that knowledge, could we then construct strains that could be a vaccine? So that was a 25-year effort that involved all these researchers in the world. And it just happened to be that we were kind of standing up when the music stopped, that we created those strains. But it was a massive effort, a massive international effort. So, you have to be really humble in all this. I mean, that you were so, and whether we made the vaccine or not, you were just happy to be part of this international effort to try and understand this virus. I mean, that was the goal. And at no point did we ever think we're trying to make a vaccine, because if you go into science that way, you're going to be pretty frustrated. You just want to be part of the process. And he was part of the process. He was part of the early process for understanding some selected aspects of mRNA and the way it works in laboratory cells and in experimental animals. That's great. He should be really happy about that. He should be happy to have been part of the process. But no, I think he just feels he was cheated.
So you mentioned just now about how long it took you to invent or co-invent the current rotavirus vaccine. And I think that's another point that people might look at the COVID vaccine and say, I don't know about that, is the fact that it was developed, tested, and approved within the span of a year following the discovery of SARS-CoV-2. But I think if we look at history, the history of vaccine development and approval, we might be able to kind of learn some things that would quell some fears that people might have looking at that at face value. So it took you and your group a long time to develop the rotavirus vaccine. But what can you tell us about other vaccines that were developed really, really quickly, and compare that to the COVID vaccine development and approval process?
Well, I would argue actually that the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, the COVID vaccine, also was a long process. Here's why. I mean, everybody points to Operation Warp Speed, which was an important effort. I mean, it was a production effort. It basically took the risk out of it for pharmaceutical companies as they moved from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 trials. But there had been work, obviously, that was done well before that. I mean, people looked to Operation Warp Speed as the hero of this pandemic. I would argue NIH was the hero of this pandemic, because in 2002, when SARS-1 raised its head, NIH, with people like Barney Graham, were starting to work on then mRNA vaccines for SARS-1. That never became a problem in this country, and so it never became a vaccine, period. But and in addition, NIH had been funding since 1997 Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman, who eventually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for their work on mRNA. So you could argue, really, this had been going on for 20 plus years, 25 years, and so it wasn't just like you snapped your fingers and there it was. Because of NIH, we had a lot of information about how to make mRNA vaccines, and then we produced them quickly.
Yeah, so we had basically all the understanding, or most of the understanding and know-how on how to make an mRNA vaccine. And then COVID comes along and creates this opportunity to make one very quickly, which is what we needed. We needed a vaccine very quickly. But then when it came to actually developing it and testing it and getting it through FDA approval, I think what people don't understand is the most important roadblock, like you say, is money and priority. Because normally people would have to submit to the FDA and then wait and then hear back and then decide, okay, do we want to do a phase 2 and do we want to continue this and then do the process over again? But that risk was gone when it came to COVID.
You're right. No, the usual progression is you do studies in experimental animals, so-called preclinical studies. where you're learning, roughly how many doses would it require. Hopefully, you have an animal model that mimics the infection in people, which is not easy, but hopefully you have that. And then now you have a rough idea of how you want to make the vaccine, but there's still a lot you don't know. So you're doing a phase 1 trial, so-called proof of concept study, where you prove that things like how many different strains do you need in the vaccine? How many doses do you need? What quantity? You do dose ranging studies to try and get a sense of that. Now you think you have it. You think you have the dose number, the dose amount. And so you go to phase 2 studies, which is usually sort of hundreds of people, to make sure there's not a common side effect problem. Then you go to phase 3 studies, which are studies to see whether it works. So those are tens of thousands of people who get the vaccine or who don't get the vaccine. And now you have evidence that it works, at least to the extent that you've tested it, and you have evidence that it's safe to the extent that you've tested it. But again, you learn again as you go into millions of people what the real safety stories are. But the good news is you have systems in place like the Vaccine Safety Data Link to pick that up. And I think so it's the process works. And you always learn as you go. I think that's intolerable to people. I think if you ask people, do you think we're going to know more about science and medicine 10 or 15 years from now than they know now? Everybody would say yes. But when it comes to their disease or our pandemic, they want to believe we know everything we need to know right now, which is never true. So you learned about myocarditis. So with the adenovirus vectored vaccines, you learned about clotting. You didn't know that. You didn't know that adenovirus vectored vaccine could stimulate platelet factor 4. You didn't know that. And so you learned it. And so there's always a human price to pay for knowledge. Always. It's invariable. I wrote a book about this called You Bet Your Life, and that was it. There's not a single medical advance, major medical advance, where you didn't learn as you went, and that learning curve was at some level painful.
One thing that you also talk about in your book is communicating uncertainty, which we did not do very well, as we've kind of touched on throughout this talk. So should the CDC just get better communicators? Should there be new channels of information? How do we? What's your view on how we kind of tackle that?
Because I'll give you an example. In 2009, there was a swine flu pandemic, and the head of the CDC at the time was Richard Besser, and he was great. I mean, if you roll back the tape, and here's a guy who's, as head of the CDC, he is out in front of the media every other day. He's at the war room at the CDC. Here's what this virus could do. Here's what it looks like. Here's what the vaccine can do. We need to vaccinate. Every other day, he was there answering the media's question, or said another way, answering the public's questions. So I saw him at a recent meeting at National Foundation of Infectious Disease meeting, and I went up to him because I've known him, and I said, "You did a great job in 2009. Thank you." And he said, "I appreciate that. I could never do it today." I said, "Why?" He said, "Social media. Social media would make it much harder for me to counter misinformation than it was in 2009.
Yeah, it's not looking good moving into the future with social media the way it is now, with rolling back of fact checking, especially. Yeah, I don't know what we're in for, but hopefully, people can learn. But in the next 4 years, I'm not so sure how much learning will happen, because, well, one thing I want to talk about before we end this conversation is this fact that RFK Jr. Very well may be the next head of the Department of Health and Human Services. So you have history with RFK Jr. You've been a vaccine safety communicator for many, many years. And I think today a lot of people see him as someone who just wants to make kids healthy. Podcasters like Theo Vaughn have called him just that, just someone who wants to make kids healthy and cares about kids. Joe Rogan has a very similar view of him. And I feel like you, as someone who's known him longer, has a pretty different view of who he is and what he stands for. So if you were questioning him during if you were questioning Robert F. Kennedy Jr. during his confirmation hearings, what are the kinds of questions that you would ask him?
So, Mr. Kennedy, thank you for appearing before us today. You are about to head, or being asked to head, an agency that has a $1.85 trillion budget and 80,000 employees. I am concerned about some of your points of view. You have said that you think there is no vaccine that is safe and effective. In fact, you have said that when you run into a parent on a hiking trail or running trail who's carrying a child, you go up to that parent and say, don't vaccinate them. And you then have said that you feel you have saved that child. If you had young children today, would you vaccinate them fully according to the CDC recommended immunization schedule? And if your answer is yes, then I want you to explain why it is that you say you go up to parents on a hiking trail and tell them not to vaccinate their children. That would be one question. Another question I would ask is, you have said that you have sided with AIDS denialists like Peter Duesberg about whether human immunodeficiency virus is the cause of AIDS. This is settled science. Nonetheless, you continue to put forward the notion in your book in 2022 that HIV is not the cause of AIDS, that rather it was either animal nitrite, the sort of poppers that were used as recreational drugs, or AZT, zidovudine, which is an antiretroviral drug that's still used in, at least in combination therapy, to treat AIDS. If you think HIV is not the cause of AIDS, will you continue to allow use of antiretroviral drugs? And if you are going to say you are going to allow it to be used, then why did you ever say, or continue to say, that HIV doesn't cause AIDS? What else would I ask? You have said that SARS-CoV-2 not only was created in a lab, but you take it one step further. You have said that it is targeted to Caucasians, to blacks, but spares Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. Do you think that's true? It seems like the biggest factors for whether or not you are killed by that virus is your age and your vaccination status and your health status. Nothing to do with your ethnic or racial background. You continue to believe that's true. What else would I ask? In your book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which is subtitled Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health, you say that you don't believe in the germ theory, which is to say that specific germs cause specific diseases, and that the treatment or prevention of those germs, like bacteria or viruses, can be life-saving. Rather, you believe in the miasma theory, something that was popular in Europe in the 1700s, which was based on the notion that because there would be organic matter that would be put out on the streets and would sit out there for days, if not longer, that the decaying organic matter would cause this sort of bad air or miasma, which could then cause disease. And that if you really want to avoid diseases, including infectious diseases, all you need to do is make sure that your immune system is in good shape and avoid environmental toxins. Do you still believe that's true? Do you still not believe in the germ theory? Because frankly, I'm embarrassed to ask this question. I think it would be a minimum requirement for someone who is head of Health and Human Services in the 21st century.
So I think that is something that people really, really need to hear, especially people who are going to be voting on his confirmation, right? You're talking to elected officials this week about this, and I hope they listen, because having someone who believes that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, or at least argues for it heavily in his book, believes that vaccines cause autism, and has said that he would not vaccinate his children if he had them today, I don't think has any place in a public health position. But a lot of people think that he has a point with what he says about the food industry and processed foods and whatnot. But there's so much stuff kind of being slid under with that package. And I think you probably think that there are other people that you would want to see who also care about food and our food system. uh, in a public health position who doesn't come with all of those uh, anti-science package deals. Um, I mean, is this a common concern in the medical field, or is this something that doctors regularly communicate to their patients about diet and lifestyle and its effect on disease?
No, I don't think we do. I think we could do a much better job. So-called preventive medicine, if you will. But what I would say is he's not wrong in the sense that we spend a lot of money per capita on health and don't really get much bang for our buck. We're sort of down the list among other developed world countries regarding infant mortality rate and longevity. So we could do better. We do have a higher rate of obesity. We do have a high rate of type 2 diabetes. A lot of that are lifestyle choices, so not easily fixed, but love to hear what his plans are. I mean, you sort of hear a lot of sort of vague hand waving of how bad things are, but not a plan. In fact, when he talks about, for example, the number of chemicals in Fruit Loops, or red dye or yellow dye in Fruit Loops, he doesn't really talk about that much over the last 20 years. I mean, this sort of feels like it's somewhat newer for him because he's really the founder of Children's Health Defense. It's all about vaccines. That's what he talks about. That's who he is. But when he talked about like the red dye and Fruit Loops, he said that, the FDA, I would fire the nutrition branch of the FDA. I'm sorry, that's the plan? And with regard to chronic diseases, he says, I think the NIH has let us down. They focused on infectious diseases instead of chronic diseases. And I think we should, and I quote, give infectious diseases a break for a while. Well, that's great, except they're not going to be giving us a break for a while. I mean, the avian flu is out there. There'll certainly be another coronavirus pandemic. You have the Ebola virus pandemics. You have Zika. I mean, there's plenty of viruses out there that can do us harm. Global, climate change has led dengue virus to come creeping up into the southern portion of the United States. And so that's the plan. Fire everybody at NIH. So he doesn't have plans. He's just a destroyer. He's not someone who builds things up because all he ever has done the last 20 years is sue people.
Yeah. Yeah. And he does not acknowledge that before vaccines became widely used in the US, there were 30,000 cases of paralytic polio every year and 1,500 deaths. And then there were 50,000 measles hospitalizations and 500 deaths from measles every year. And 6,000 cases of deafness caused by mumps every year, 20,000 cases of blindness, deafness, and heart defects caused by rubella every year, and 75,000 cases of hospitalization from rotavirus and 60 deaths from rotavirus every year. I don't think that someone who refuses to acknowledge this is really interested in children's health. But I think he would say that, and I've heard him say that it's hard to kill a healthy child with infectious disease. He thinks that these problems, this goes into his miasma theory promotion, that nutrition and general health can prevent these ailments. But he has no medical degree. He has no science training. You have science training and a medical degree, and you're a pediatrician. So how wrong is that statement?
No, I'll give you a perfect example. When I was a resident at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, there was a 9-month-old baby who came into the hospital who had a couple of days of a rotavirus infection, fever, vomiting, diarrhea. And so it's becoming progressively more dehydrated. And the doctor over the phone had recommended what you always recommended, which is take frequent sips of fluids containing, electrolytes like sugar or salt. But he was vomiting. It's very hard to rehydrate a vomiting child. That's why the World Health Organization's oral rehydration scheme to try and decrease the 2,000 deaths that would occur every day from rotavirus in this world didn't work. And they eventually abandoned it. This mother was a good mother. She cared about her child. It was a healthy child. So we brought the child back into the treatment room to put in an intravenous line, but he was too dehydrated. So we called a surgeon to come down and basically take a large bore bone marrow needle and drill it into the child's tibia to try and get fluid at least into the bone marrow. Didn't work. The child expired before our eyes, before we could rehydrate her to the point that she was could live. And then comes that conversation where you walk out of that room and you have to go tell the mother that her previously healthy 8 or 9-month-old child is dead. And so I wish he would work at a children's hospital so we could see how dead wrong he is about the things that he says. He thinks healthy children don't die. Work at a children's hospital. I'll give you another perfect example. I trained in the late 1970s, between 77 and 1980 at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. When you did your emergency department time, which would be like 12-hour shifts for like 3 straight weeks, 21 straight days, 12-hour shifts in the emergency department, you would do 2 to 3 spinal taps a night. Because what didn't we have? We didn't have a Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine yet. We didn't have a meningococcal vaccine yet. We didn't have a conjugate pneumococcal vaccine for children yet. You're doing spinal taps all the time. Pediatricians today can't do spinal taps. They can't. When a child comes into our hospital and needs a spinal tap, it's the interventional radiologists that do it. They've lost that technique. And I worry at some level, should immunization rates fall, and you start to see some of these diseases come back, diseases that these young doctors have also never seen before and never taken care of before. In many ways, we're not ready for this. I mean, I'll give you another example. Measles. Okay, measles, you don't want measles in the hospital. You don't want a child with measles in the hospital because it's a highly contagious disease, and there are a lot of people in your hospital who are at risk because they're immune compromised for whatever reason, cancer, other sort of immunologically depressing therapies. So we had a little outbreak in Philadelphia. So some kids came into the emergency department with measles. They admitted them right away. What are you doing? I mean, unless the child is severely dehydrated or has pneumonia and requires oxygen therapy, don't bring them into the hospital. You just sort of watch these things. I'll give you another example, and then we can end with this. There was a child who had Haemophilus influenza B can cause a disease called epiglottitis, which is swelling of the epiglottis. The epiglottis sits on top of your windpipe. When it gets swollen, it can occlude the windpipe, and you can die of suffocation. So we used to see that all the time when I was training in the late 70s. We had a special room where when kids came in with epiglottitis, they would go into that special room. It was dark, had an aquarium in it, keep them calm. The people from the operating room would come down, quietly bring the child up into like a darkened elevator so that they wouldn't have a spasm of their epiglottis, which could cause them to die. Okay, so here was a child with epiglottitis at another hospital. This was when I was at Children's now. And they brought him to our hospital by ambulance. What are you doing? You can't do a tracheostomy in an ambulance. I mean, normally what would happen is you would go to that hospital and do what you needed to do there. You would never transport them because they could occlude their airway and die of suffocation. So we're not used to this. And hopefully we'll never get used to it again, but I worry.
Paul, thank you so much for your time. Where can people go to learn more about science, vaccines, and overall health?
So Charlotte Moser and I started 25 years ago, the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital Philadelphia. On that website, we really try and answer all the questions that you have. And we're trying to fight the good fight in terms of all the disinformation that's out there.
Again, thank you for your time, and good luck in talking to our elected officials to hopefully not confirm a disaster, a public health disaster waiting to happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.